Good day. Today's program is again going to be largely dominated by events in Ukraine. We're starting to see more and more moves by more and more players, which to my mind rather strongly indicate, in fact all but confirm, that we are indeed now entering the end game. The most important of these moves is President Zelensky's visit to the United States, to Washington, D.C., where, by the way, he now is. Now, I'm going to just make here a few quick observations about this visit, and they're made off the bat of a program that I did on the Duran with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Now, over the course of that program, Alex suggested that President Zelensky's rather odd journey to Buenos Aires to attend the inauguration of Argentina's newly elected president, President Milei, was actually a form of cover for the trip to Washington, which the United States and Ukraine had already in private agreed on before. The administration did not want to appear to extend an invitation to Zelensky to visit Washington too openly. They understand that President Zelensky, a lot of his political capital in Washington has by now been burnt up. They didn't want to imply that the administration has become too close to President Zelensky as an individual, and doubtless they're also aware of the political struggles that are taking place in Kiev at the moment, and they may have doubts about President Zelensky's longevity in political office. And of course, it would have been deeply embarrassing for them if they'd issued an invitation to President Zelensky, he were to travel to Washington, meet with the president, address the various senators and Congress people, and then return to Kiev, only to lose the ongoing power struggle which is taking place there. So it was important for the administration to convey the impression that this was a visit arranged at very short notice as a result of an opportunity that arose from the fact that President Zelensky had decided to attend President Milei's inauguration in Buenos Aires. And that would limit any degree of political damage. It would mean that the administration did not appear to be too close to Zelensky, which might not be entirely politically opportune, either in Washington or in Kiev at the present time. Now, that is the theory, and I want to stress it is only a theory, that Alex Christoforou floated over the course of our program, and I have to say it makes total sense to me. It is exactly the kind of complex device that one might expect to see when the parties begin to become increasingly concerned and even desperate as they enter the end game. The administration does not want to be seen getting too close to Zelensky, but they still want him in Washington because they need to explain some things to him. And of course, if he can be successful in his lobbying, well, so much the better. So that is why, so it seems to me, following on what Alex Christoforou suggested, we've had President Zelensky go to Washington in this roundabout way, going first to Buenos Aires and then to Washington itself. Now, as to the effect, what will happen when President Zelensky is in Washington, well, about that we will have to wait to see. He is currently there. He's going to meet with the president himself, obviously. He's going to meet with other senior US officials, obviously. He's also going to have a meeting with members of the Senate. Apparently, this meeting has been arranged by Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell. Senator McConnell has, up till recently, been a strong advocate of aid for Ukraine. He's now shifted his position in response to the hardening of opposition for aid to Ukraine that we're now seeing in the House of Representatives. But anyway, Senator Senator McConnell has arranged with Schumer for this meeting with the senators to take place. But critically, Zelensky is not meeting with representatives from the House, where opposition to continued aid for Ukraine is strongest. He has been restricted to a meeting with the new Speaker of the House, Senator Mike Johnson. And as I've discussed in various programs, Speaker Johnson seems to me to be a rather more canny political operator than I'd initially expected. He's made it fairly clear to the White House that the House is not going to vote to fund further appropriations for Ukraine until they have some clarity as to what it is exactly that the administration plans in order to achieve a successful outcome in Ukraine, and until there is some important movement by the administration to respond to Republican concerns about the state of the border, an issue which probably, in fact definitely, is much more concerning for most people in the United States than Ukraine itself is. Now, there is no logical reason why meeting with Zelensky is going to change Speaker Johnson's position. It's difficult to see what Zelensky is going to tell Johnson that Johnson hasn't already heard and which he hasn't already rejected, and how exactly a personal meeting between Zelensky and Johnson can change the political calculations and electoral calculations that underpin Johnson's various decisions. But as I've discussed many times, a week is a long time in politics. We have several days now before Congress is due to rise on Friday. And I cannot say definitely that this effort to bring Zelensky to Washington will not bear some fruit. It is conceivable that Congress will be prevailed upon to vote some aid for Ukraine, perhaps even the entire $61 billion package. Now, if that happens, there's a further point I do want to make, which is that in that case, if that happens, it will not be, in my opinion, because of any great persuasive skills of President Zelensky's own. It's difficult, as I said, to see that Zelensky's in a position to say anything to grizzled veterans of the American political system, like I presume Speaker Johnson is, that is going to make them change their minds. My impression of American politics is that despite the kind of things that US politicians often say, sentimentality is not actually a feature of American politics and of American politicians. It's not how American politicians make their decisions, they're not going to change their mind simply because they might feel sorry for President Zelensky or for Ukraine. But anyway, saying that, if they change their position, then it will be because of other factors. And I suspect that in the case of the Republicans, the clue to understanding why that would be is these attempts by the administration to try and persuade Congress people to support the package, because the administration says that weapons for Ukraine, production of weapons for Ukraine, will keep factories humming across the United States, and that means that there will be jobs, and those jobs will, of course, be provided to the constituents of whatever Congress people choose to vote to support this aid package. Now, I haven't really discussed this issue in any great detail, and I don't propose to do so in this programme. But again, I think people perhaps misunderstand the nature of the message that is being given here. Because, of course, whether or not aid for Ukraine does really translate to jobs on the ground across the United States, I think that is, for US senators and representatives, a minor issue, if I have to be frank. After all, the jobs that will be generated will not probably be very large, and it's difficult to believe that this will make any fundamental difference to any electoral outcomes. Rather, it is a coded way of telling senators and Congress people, vote for Ukraine, vote for aid for Ukraine. That money will then find its way into the military industrial system, and some of it will probably, so that money will then probably, in fact definitely, find itself being donated in an entirely legal and proper way into your various funds and re-election funds and those sort of things. And that will, of course, make your life easier, not just in the forthcoming elections in the United States, which turn very much, as I've come to realize in the United States, on who has the deeper pockets, but of course, some of this money going in this entirely lawful way to your various funds and support funds and all of the rest. Well, that also, in a similarly completely lawful way, will make some people's, some representatives, some senators' lives more comfortable. As you will understand, again, I am having to resort to complex language, more complex language than I would like to use. But there it is. So I think this is what that message was all about. And if we do see a sudden reversal in the Republican stance, or the stance of some Republicans, between now and Friday, it will be more because of that factor, the factor I've just outlined, than because of President Zelensky's persuasive skills, of which, by the way, so far as I can see, he has none. So there we go. Anyway, he's going to meet with the senators. He's going to speak to Johnson. We will see what comes out of all of those meetings. But to reiterate again what I said in my program yesterday, the other purpose of this visit, perhaps the real purpose of this visit, is to explain the situation in Washington, perhaps through the president himself, unquestionably in the White House, to explain the real situation to President Zelensky. The political consensus behind support for Ukraine is collapsing. It is collapsing in the United States. A plurality of American voters now opposes aid for Ukraine. And it is quite plausible that that plurality will eventually become a majority. There's an editorial about all of this in the Financial Times, and it concludes with these words: Republican strategists can unfortunately, fortunately is the Financial Times' choice of words, it is strongly aligned with the administration, can unfortunately claim the GOP lawmakers are in tune with their electorate. An FD Michigan Ross poll found 48% of Americans thought the US was spending too much on aid to Kiev. Only 11% felt it was not enough. 22 months since Putin launched his war, Western leaders have yet to drive the message home to voters that the relatively paltry cost of support to Ukraine so far would be dwarfed by the spending needed on bolstering defences were Russia's president to be allowed to win. Notice that it's always a case in the Financial Times, in many Western publications, in neocon publications, that it's not the other side winning, it's the other side being allowed to win by the Western powers, admitting that the Russians might be winning the war, might actually win the war because of their own efforts and resources, would challenge the entire structure of belief which exists in neocon circles that the United States and the collective West are supremely powerful, and that when they will an outcome, it must therefore automatically happen. Anyway, that's another issue to talk about shortly. But they will no doubt, the Biden administration will be talking all about that to Zelensky. They will be explaining to him support is ebbing away. If we can get this aid package through Congress, it's going to be very difficult. We're going to burn up some political capital to do it. There's little chance that we are going to succeed in getting another further aid packages to Ukraine further down the line. And then, of course, there is the other factor, which is, of course, it is far from clear that all of these attempts to, shall we say, financially induce Congress people and senators to vote for this aid package for Ukraine will be successful. I've spoken in the past about the fact that Speaker Johnson is a shrewd and canny political operator. And of course, he is very conscious of what happened to his predecessor, Speaker McCarthy, who lost his speaker's position because he cut deals with the administration that the Republicans, the populist Republicans in the House, didn't like, and did so specifically on the issue of Ukraine. And there is one thing that Johnson has done which makes me think that he is much more likely to stick with his current position, his current stance, which is to block aid to Ukraine, than to change it. And that is that on the 13th of December, tomorrow, in other words, he has scheduled a vote in the House of Representatives as to whether or not to bring an impeachment inquiry against the president, against President Biden himself. Now, if Speaker Johnson is intending to greenlight this aid package for Ukraine, then that seems to me an odd thing to do. given that in any impeachment process, it is very likely indeed, I would say it was all but certain, that President Biden's various connections through his son, primarily, with Ukraine and with the business community there. Again, I am choosing my words extremely carefully. Anyway, it is highly likely that all of that will be brought up in any articles of impeachment that the House of Representatives eventually votes for. And I find it difficult to understand why Johnson, knowing this, would therefore decide to vote for an aid package to Ukraine. The impeachment process and the aid package, appear to me to be in direct political contradiction with each other. Over and above and beyond that, Johnson presumably knows that when Congress reconvenes next year, after it rises, presumably on Friday, the major concern, at least for members of the House, for Republican members of the House, will be the impeachment of the President of the United States. They will not want to think about Ukraine at that point. Given which, again, I find it difficult to understand why he would move forward with impeachment at this time if he intended to greenlight an aid package for Ukraine. Anyway, we will see what is going to happen. I've been getting, as I'm making this program, some dribbles of reports about the kind of things that President Zelensky has been saying to the senators. It seems to me all the old cliches and tropes have been recycled again. We can't let Putin win. The United States is under some sort of moral duty to help the freedom fighters and all of these sort of things. It doesn't seem to me as if Zelensky is really addressing the actual concerns of American representatives and senators. But then, as I said, it's hardly plausible that he would do so. By the time this video is published, it is quite likely that you will know more about the outcome of President Zelensky's visit to Kiev than I do now, because I would not be surprised if at some point over the next few hours some kind of final decision is made. When it is made, I will obviously learn about it and I will have to discuss it in my next video. Anyway, the Financial Times, that same editorial in the Financial Times where I cited that opinion poll, talks about the implications of a failure to pass the package. And it's interesting that it focuses not on military aid. Military aid to Ukraine, so far as I can see, is basically coming to an end, and I will discuss shortly why, but rather on the economics. It says that if the two packages, this is the aid package that is currently before Congress, and a parallel 50 billion euro package, which the EU so far is trying to put together. If the two passages fail to pass in political votes this week, Ukraine's macroeconomic financial stability could be imperiled, calling into question its ability to sustain its campaign. Now that is a subtle hint of a subtle way of saying that if financial aid from the West is withdrawn, there is a very high possibility, some would say a probability, that the Ukrainian government will start having to print money, in which case Ukraine will descend into hyperinflation. Again, I mentioned this, I floated this in a program that I did 2 days ago. I had a bit of pushback from some people about that, but you see that this is the principal concern that even the Financial Times has. Now, the key thing to understand about these aid packages, the one that is floating through the United States and the one that is working its way through the European Union, is that they are not going to affect decisively the military situation in Ukraine. And there is an exceptionally good article in Responsible Statecraft, which was actually published some weeks ago. I've only recently come to learn about it. It was published on the 27th of November 2023 and written by Mark Episkopos, which explains why the military aid that we're talking about cannot change the outcome of the situation in Ukraine. And the answer, straightforwardly, is that there is no stalemate situation in Ukraine. Russia is winning the war. And the article contains a whole series of quotes from all sorts of military experts. There's this quote from Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow at the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a fervent supporter of Ukraine, but nonetheless, in my opinion, for all that, a serious and intelligent military analyst. Brian Boletic at the New Atlas discusses his thoughts on many occasions. Anyway, Michael Kaufman says, I see no durable or stable stalemate at this stage. The present inability of either side to establish a decisive advantage is not structural. Extrapolating from the present phase of the war into the future is an exercise fraught with error, in my view. Now, that's a very complicated way of saying that the Russians are getting stronger and stronger. Ukraine is getting weaker and weaker. It's not a stalemate. It is, as I've discussed many times, an unstable equilibrium whereby the front lines themselves remain relatively unchanging. But the Ukrainians lose men and machines at a rate that they cannot replace and which the West cannot replace for them, whilst the Russians grow stronger every day. And there is only one possible endpoint for that kind of situation. Anyway, that was Michael Kaufman. Then there's a quote from George Beebe. And as you would expect, George Beebe, who wrote that fine article a couple of months ago, back in August with Jim Webb, in which they both suggested that Ukraine go onto the defensive, give up on its pointless summer counteroffensive, go onto the defensive instead, and start negotiating in earnest with the Russians. Anyway, George Beebe, much more forthright, much more straightforward, much more clear about the realities of the war on the front lines today. He's again quoted in this article as saying, those who believe this war has settled into a long-term stalemate make the mistake of measuring the relative progress of each side with maps. They see that the front lines have not moved significantly over the last year and conclude that the sides are stalemated. By other metrics, but other metrics, though, paint a different picture. Ukraine is using up its quite limited supplies of men, weapons and ammunition, and the West cannot provide what Ukraine needs. This is not a formula for stalemate. It's a formula for Ukraine's eventual collapse or capitulation. So, George Beebe sets it out very clearly. But even more interesting, and in some ways more in depth, are comments from a highly decorated senior officer of the US military, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. And he's quoted in this article as saying the following: despite everything that's happened, despite all the stuff we have given, the Bradleys, the M1 tanks, that's the Abrams tanks, Patriot air defense systems, the Challenger tanks, the Leopard tanks, all those things, nothing changed at all except the casualty count. Whilst the lines haven't changed, I don't call it a stalemate because I think time is continuing to work against Ukraine. And coming now to the aid package, the one that Biden wants Congress to approve, that Zelensky has come to Washington to support. This is what Davis says, and it is crucial. Biden is only shooting for $60 billion for the whole financial year instead of $113 billion. That's what Ukraine got last year. So even if he gets every penny that he's asking for, it's going to be half what it was last year, and we've given all the excess equipment that we have. Anything we give now comes out of muscle, out of the bones, and I don't think we're going to give up that much more stuff, certainly not at the level they need to replace all their losses. So what Davis is saying is, it's anyway half the money that the United States gave to Ukraine last year, and in terms of military equipment, it's nowhere near enough, because the United States, putting aside all questions of money, doesn't have the weapons to give Ukraine that it had before. And the key, as always, is ammunition. And again, I'm quoting from Davis, they're not going to have the ammunition to continue to wage a stalemate. And then the article goes on to say, Davis compared dwindling Ukrainian stocks with Russia's expanded domestic production of critical munitions and drones. Kiev's munition woes were recently compounded by the diversion of up to tens of thousands of 155mm shells, originally slated for Ukraine, to Israel in the weeks following the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war. The next year, and probably into this winter, and these are Davis's words again, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect the Ukrainian army at some point along the front to actually buckle. The battlefield trends working in favor of Russia and against Ukraine were largely likely exacerbated by the Ukraine's costly counteroffensive. So all that money, all those machines that was given last year was blown in the summer offensive, and that has left Ukraine not just weaker, but the West out of equipment as well. And far from being weaker, Ukraine is now, in effect, mortally wounded. And we have other comments by other people, but coming back to Davis, he tries to consider what the Russians might do. He says, I think they're preparing for something larger, but I bet they would wait until the winter to continue to build up. And he says every category is in Russia's favor and will continue to tilt in Russia's favor. So I just don't think it continue to stay a stalemate. but I can't say with any confidence whether Russia will choose the strategic path of a World War I model, in other words, war achieved, victory achieved through attrition, overwhelming them with enough volume until they buckle, or if they're going to try to bust through somewhere with a big maneuver. And none of us knows, and we can all guess, but there we go. So that's the realities. Even if Biden gets his package, even if Zelensky gets his money, all that it will do at best is buy Zelensky and the Ukrainians a few more months before Russia all but inevitably wins. It would take an extreme political crisis in Moscow now to change this trajectory of travel, or conceivably a massive military blunder by the Russian High Command, which, careful, professional, and risk-averse people as they are, they show no sign of making. So there we go. That is the reality of the war in Ukraine today. Now, that brings me to actually what is going on the battlefronts. And yesterday and this morning there was a cascade of news, and all of it is bad for Ukraine. Perhaps the most important battle, the one that is attracting all the great attention, one which Davis himself, by the way, discusses briefly in this article, but remember, it's some weeks old now. Anyway, the big news, if it is correct, is from Avdiivka. There were reports that I saw this morning that the Russians have now broken through into the metropolitan, the residential area of Avdiivka itself. Now, it is crucial to understand that this does not mean that the Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka are necessarily about to collapse. Street fighting can be very protracted. It can take a very long time. We saw that in Mariupol and in Bakhmut. It could be many weeks before the Russians are able to consolidate control of Avdiivka, even if they have managed to achieve a breakthrough into the residential areas of the town. And I have to add at this point that at this moment in time, I don't know definitely that this is the case. But this report came alongside a cascade of other reports about the Russians making significant gains all around the perimeter of Avdiivka itself, rolling up Ukrainian fortified positions, pushing the Ukrainian troops deeper into Avdiivka, and threatening the supply lines from Avdiivka, which go through all the way up the SAC, that is this Avdiivka salient, all the way up and eventually come out the other end around the place of Berdichi and Stepnoye. And since I mentioned those two places, I understand that there is now a video which appears to show Russian troops in Stepnoye, and there is a consensus, apparently, that this is a relatively recent video. I haven't seen this video myself, but it does seem as if the Russians, despite various claims that they've been pushed back from Stepnoye, that they do still have at least a presence in that village. In other words, this difficult encounter battle in Stepnoye continues to rage. So, very bad news from Avdiivka. And the news from every other part of the battlefront is equally bad. We're getting now lots of reports, for example, that the Russians have managed to make further advances in the Bakhmut area, that they managed to capture more of the high ground around Klishevka, that they've entered Bogdanovka and have entrenched themselves in the northern part of that particular village. Again, I can't confirm whether this is true or not, But it does seem that the Russians have a strong forward momentum around Bakhmut. And interestingly, even as they prepare to storm Bogdanovka, forward units of the Russian military continue to push along the roads towards Chasov Yar, the other town in the area of Bakhmut. And it does look as if once Bogdanovka is finally captured, that the Russians will push on and attack Chasov Yar. And there are reports from all sorts of other places. I've heard a report that a Ukrainian brigade, I believe it was the 57th Brigade, the soldiers of that brigade have now published another video saying that they have suffered extraordinary losses. This is in the northern front lines, in places like Kupiansk. I believe it's in Kupiansk that it's located, that the situation in Kupiansk is disastrous for Ukraine, that the losses are too high, that the entire brigade has had to withdraw from the fighting there because it is in urgent need of rest and reinforcement and reconstruction. And I understand that even the reconstituted Azov brigade in the Bakhmut area, the brigade that has been launching Ukraine's offensive towards Klashevka, started that offensive in May. It's been fighting bitterly in that area for months now. Even the Azov brigade has now issued further statements saying that they cannot continue to fight in Klashevka, around Bakhmut, that the brigade has suffered such heavy losses that they have to retreat to the rear in order to reconstitute themselves. And this is the pattern all along the front lines. Soldiers in Krinky, of the Dnieper River, we know from the BBC, increasingly questioning why they're even there, why they're being asked to die, to hold this bridgehead, which Ukraine can't advance from. Articles starting to appear in the Ukrainian media, questioning the entire logic of this bridgehead in Krinky. Reports that the Ukrainians are being pushed back in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. Some reports that the Russians are preparing to reoccupy Rabotino itself, reversing completely whatever hard-earned gains Ukraine achieved in this area in the offensive of the summer. And at the same time, we have this constant simmering conflict between Zelensky and Zelensky, and the media in the West is now finally acknowledging it and is talking about it. And we've had an editorial in The Guardian, which appears, which has been not only one of Ukraine's most fervent media supporters in Britain, but which in my opinion has played an instrumental role in ensuring that the Labour Party and much of its electoral base remains in line with the British government over this conflict in Ukraine. Anyway, The Guardian has now published an editorial. It says that in view of the fact that there is a stalemate in Ukraine, I've just explained that there isn't one, a more realistic approach is a no bad thing. And it then goes on to discuss that there is now little prospect of the war ending in some sort of victory, but perhaps negotiations must be a good idea. But one way or the other, of course, the West must continue to support Ukraine, despite the fact that the situation is deteriorating and the oil sanctions, as it admits, are no longer working. And the most interesting thing about this editorial, the only reason I reference it, is because it straightforwardly admits that there are now divisions, that there is now conflict in Ukraine, in Kiev, between various elements of the Ukrainian leadership. Amid the exhaustion and despondence, this is from The Guardian, ordinary Ukrainians too are beginning to question Zelensky's stubborn optimism. General Zelensky is seen as a potential future political rival to Mr. Zelensky. Another political figure, Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, has claimed that Ukraine is sliding into authoritarianism. Politics is no longer frozen by the conflict. And then, of course, we go on to read that it's not yet all completely fallen apart, but I would suggest that it's getting worse all the time. So, there we are. No stalemate in this war. Russia is winning. And I think that if there's going to be a realistic diplomatic effort, an attempt to resolve this conflict by negotiations, that fact needs to be understood. Going back to that article in Responsible Statecraft, the one by Episcopos, Mark Episcopos, he actually makes the point in the article that pretending that there is a stalemate when there isn't one all but guarantees that wrong decisions are going to be made. And this comes back to my original point, the point that I've made many times. Ukraine's offensive this summer, last summer, didn't fail. It was defeated. The Russians won a convincing victory over Ukraine in what has so far been by far the biggest battle of the war. And this victory was decisive, and it was one which inflicted impossibly high levels of losses upon the Ukrainians. Until and unless this fact is understood, all the political maneuvers and political games, all the talk about negotiations, all the discussion about aid packages, be it in the United States and in Europe, are simply conjuring on air. They are not based on a substantive recognition of the realities. Now, I say that because, again, the Russians have been making their own positions increasingly clear. And one particular Russian official has been highly visible over the last couple of days. And this is this newly appointed ambassador, Ambassador Miroshnik. Now, he is obviously a professional diplomat working for Russia's foreign ministry. I'm not going to pretend that I know very much about him. He's not featured in much of the discussion about Ukraine before, but he is now someone who is discussing and talking about lots of things connected to the war. He seems to have some kind of a brief to research war crimes allegedly committed by the Ukrainians. And the fact that he has been given such a high profile leads me to think that he's been given the green light to say the things that he is saying, which, by the way, are consistent with what Putin has been saying, and that he might conceivably be, in the event that some kind of diplomatic process does take place, he might conceivably be the lead negotiator in any such negotiation. Now, over the last 24 hours, Miroshnik has said some very remarkable things. He has said that the war that is being fought in Ukraine is a war of national liberation. National liberation by the Russian people, on behalf of the Russian people in Ukraine who are being oppressed by the Ukrainian government. He quite straightforwardly speaks about the Ukrainian government as if he considered it illegitimate. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, he's also said that he considers that any final negotiation about the future of Ukraine will not be between Russia and Ukraine. It will certainly not be between Russia and the political leadership in Kiev, which Miroshnik clearly said is an unacceptable negotiating partner for the Russians. Rather, it will be a direct negotiation between Russia and the United States. Rather like, in other words, what happened at the end of the Vietnam War, when the North Vietnamese refused outright to negotiate with the South Vietnamese. They did not recognize the legitimacy of the government in Saigon. Negotiations nonetheless happened, and they took place not between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. They took place between North Vietnam and the United States, and they were held in Paris. So that is effectively, essentially, what Miroshnik is looking towards. Now, yesterday I said that it wasn't just Miroshnik who's been taking this very hard line, who's also been talking about Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians as branches of the same tree, the tree that is the Russian people, a claim recently made by none other than Vladimir Putin in a speech that he made on the 4th of November to the Russian Civic Council. Anyway, another person who's been speaking as well is Sergei Narishkin, who is the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Agency, the SVR, the man who is, in effect, who heads the agency that is the closest approximation in Russia to America's CIA. Now, I mentioned in my program yesterday that Narishkin also is calling into question the legitimacy of the government in Kiev, and that he also has adopted Putin's language. He too speaks of Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians as branches of the same tree, the triune that makes in aggregate the Russian nation. But as I didn't realize, Narishkin also floated the possibility that the United States might at some point organize some kind of coup in Kiev, arrange for President Zelensky to be replaced, and replaced by someone presumably who the United States found easier to control and who might consent to negotiations of some sort taking place with the Russians. Now, I should say that Narishkin was talking very vaguely about this, but earlier today, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, was asked about these comments of Narishkin. And Peskov said that Narishkin made these comments on the basis of solid intelligence, that the Russians, however, don't expect all this to happen anytime very soon, but that it is a real probability or possibility given the realities on the ground. So, one can make of this what one likes. it could be that the Russians, Narishkin and Peskov and the others, are simply stirring up the pot in Kiev, that they're intensifying, they're taking action to intensify mutual suspicions between Ukrainian officials and to deepen the power struggle that is taking place there. Or perhaps, as Peskov says, the Russians do have actual intelligence that there are discussions underway between the Americans and some people in Kiev about eventually replacing President Zelensky. Now, a lot of people have talked about that in the past. I've explained some of the difficulties of this. It does appear, by the way, that far from all of the military backs Zelensky, General Syrski, who remains the ground forces commander and who retains command of Ukrainian forces in the northern front lines in Kupiansk, Liman and Bakhmut, he apparently continues to be loyal to Zelensky and probably has ambitions to take Zelensky's place. But anyway, this might be a complex and very difficult operation to carry out if we're talking about a coup, even if it is backed by the United States. But rumors about it continue to swell, and I've seen now that various Ukrainian Telegram channels, I believe in this case it was Resident, a Telegram channel which I also believe, by the way, to be largely controlled by Zelensky. Anyway, Resident is apparently reporting that Zelensky and his team recently convened meetings with high-level security officials from the SBU, Ukraine's internal intelligence agencies, and other internal security organizations to discuss the risks of the coup and the risk of protests in Kiev escalating with armed men, soldiers, appearing on the streets, possibly protesting the conduct of the war, and some of them might be there spontaneously, having left their units to attend these protests in Kiev. Some of the troops of the 110th Brigade, which has been defending Avdiivka, have talked about doing exactly that. Anyway, it seems as if Zelensky and his officials are seriously worried that the internal security situation in Kiev could be deteriorating. And there's things which are happening in Kiev itself which might be making people there even more unhappy with Ukraine's government. Apparently, I've seen pictures of this, you can find them all on Slavyangrad. There's been serious flooding of the Kiev metro. I'm not going to discuss the causes of that. There's been a massive hack of a mobile telephone network, an internet network in Kiev. One gets the sense that Kiev, which until recently has been fairly insulated from all of these problems, the problems that have been taking place around all of the rest of Ukraine, that these problems are now starting to reach Kiev itself. And of course, if the aid package doesn't pass Congress, and if the aid package doesn't pass Congress in the United States, the odds against the EU being able to get its aid package to Ukraine together, its 50 billion euro aid package to Ukraine together and passed, will start to reduce. If Ukraine isn't able to get continued Western financial support, then, as the Financial Times said, as I said in my program yesterday, the economy, the Ukrainian economy, will descend into deepening crisis. And if there is a hyperinflationary event, that is going to make people in Kiev more angry still. So one can understand very well why Zelensky is so nervous. And there's another sign of the nervousness, in my opinion, of the Ukrainian authorities. Very incredibly, they have published a photograph of the Ukrainian opposition politician who the Ukrainian security services recently murdered in Russia. Now, they made it fairly clear this time, they've hardly bothered to conceal the fact that this person was actually assassinated by the Ukrainians themselves, by the SBU, that they located him, tracked him down, and killed him. But why publish the photograph? Well, of course, it could be a warning to other potential traitors to Ukraine, people who might be thinking of going over to the Russian side, and maybe there's increasing numbers of those. But I can't help but think that it's also a signal to any potential coup plotters of the ruthlessness of the current Ukrainian government, of the group of people around President Zelensky, and their willingness to take extremely strong measures to protect themselves and to remain in control. We've had those mysterious incidents, the one of the man, the aide to Zelensky, who blew himself up when he pulled a pin from a grenade on the occasion of his birthday, something that's never been explained. We've had the poisoning of Budanov's wife, and now straight after that we've had the publication of this photograph of this man murdered with his face in the snow. I haven't, by the way, looked at this photograph. I don't want to see photographs like that. So, something of a witch's brew in Kiev, a deteriorating situation on the front lines. And I come back to the original point that I made in this program. Western policy at the moment remains delusional. Western leaders, Western governments, the government of the United States, most of all, still seem to believe that they can hold things together in Ukraine until the November election. We had that article in The Guardian a couple of days ago by Emma Ashford, which said that what Ukraine needs to do is to go onto the defensive and to talk about a stalemate and a freezing of the conflict, because that will enable the Biden team to change the narrative, and that will facilitate President Biden's re-election in the autumn. I'm summarizing Emma Ashford's article according to my own understanding. To my mind, that essentially is what she said. Now, that does not acknowledge the actual realities in Ukraine, that Ukraine has suffered a catastrophic military defeat over the course of the summer, that the situation in Ukraine is not one of stalemate, that the Ukrainian army is finding it increasingly difficult to hold the line and is crumbling, that morale amongst Ukraine's soldiers is crumbling as well, that there are now visible signs of disaffection and even mutiny in some units, that there is a critical shortage of ammunition. And this is something that report after report now confirms. One of the reasons why the Russians are able to make these advances is because whereas previously the Ukrainians could put down heavy artillery fire against Russian forces that sought to advance, today, because of the disastrous situation with artillery ammunition. The Ukrainians are no longer able to do that. The Russians, by contrast, are getting stronger. Their artillery seems to suffer from no shortages. Their air force is become increasingly active. Their production of tanks and machines and, of course, drones is increasing by the day. And their army continues to grow stronger. Every day now, it continues to get stronger and bigger. And the point is that pretending that this isn't the case, that there is some mechanism whereby this conflict can be frozen and put on the back burner until the election is out of the way, and letting people like Zelensky carry the water is misconceived and even absurd. If nothing else, it is putting Zelensky himself in a very dangerous position. And the best thing for the United States to do is to contact the Russians, perhaps not directly, perhaps through one of Russia's and America's mutual friends, India maybe, Saudi Arabia possibly, some country like that, inform the Russians that the United States is prepared to talk, that it's prepared to enter into substantive discussions about the security situation in Europe, announce that fact, appoint a negotiating team headed by a strong diplomat. William Burns is an obvious possibility. Give that team plenipotentiary powers, agree a venue, might have to be outside Europe, and get those negotiations like the ones that took place in Paris between the North Vietnamese and the Americans, and the ones, by the way, which took place between the Americans and the Taliban in Doha. Get those negotiations underway. I am getting reports every day about what is happening on the battlefields. I'm only able to summarize them on these programs. If you want to get a true sense of what is happening on the battlefields in Ukraine, the right place to go, I've said this many times, is the Slavyangrad Telegram channel. Though it makes no secret of its pro-Russian bias, it is nonetheless an accurate reporter of events in the war, and will provide you with a very good analysis of what is happening, and it also acts as an effective site aggregator, bringing together information not just from Russian but also Ukrainian sources. And I noticed that recently Slavyangrad has also teamed up with the Military Summary channel, and you can see the way in which these two bodies now work together. Anyway, go there and you will get a feel of what is really going on. And the reality is that if the front lines at the moment appear to be static, that is more an illusion, actually, than a reality. In fact, in many places, the Russians now are undertaking some quite significant advances. The Ukrainians are suffering more and more losses. And for the record, my own feeling is that the momentum of the Russian advance, incremental as it is, and across the widest possible front, that the momentum of this advance is now accelerating. Anyway, this is where I finished this program today. There'll be more from me shortly about the situation in the Middle East and in other places, but I think this is something I wanted to discuss. We will no doubt have a lot more news by the time I do my next video about President Zelensky's trip to Washington and what, if anything, he achieves whilst he is there. And perhaps we might even have some useful leaks about what the Americans told him and whether he's paid any attention to their advice. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can see the links under this video. You can also check out our shop. Buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.